The roar of artillery had been the rhythm of their days for so long that silence felt almost unreal when it finally arrived. One moment, the air trembled with the familiar thunder of shells and the ragged shouts of men trying to be heard over them. The next, it was as if someone had pulled a thick blanket over the world. The German soldiers didn't notice the quiet at first. Their bodies still twitched with the memory of impact. Their ears still rang with echoes long gone. But as they marched under British guard, away from the torn soil of the front, a new kind of stillness settled around them, wide, cool, and strangely gentle. Gravel shifted softly under their boots. A distant bird cried out somewhere beyond the trees. It was the kind of quiet that belonged to places untouched by war, and stepping into it felt almost like stepping out of themselves.
Some of the men kept glancing back, half expecting the front to reach out and drag them home to its chaos. Others stared ahead, not sure what lay beyond the wire that awaited them. There was no immediate fear anymore, only an unfamiliar looseness in the chest, a slow unwinding that felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. Even the British escorts spoke in low voices, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile calm settling over their captives. And in that softened space, between surrender and arrival, the soldiers found themselves breathing more deeply than they had in months. It was the first moment when they realized captivity might hold a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with weapons, but with the quieter struggles of memory, identity, and the slow return of human thought. The first sight of the British camp felt almost unreal to men who had braced themselves for brutality. They had imagined mud, overcrowding, punishment, and the cold indifference of victors. Instead, the camp looked more like a quiet settlement than a prison. Neatly built wooden barracks stood in even rows, their roofs catching the afternoon light. Paths of packed earth wound calmly between them, swept clean as if someone cared about the order of things.
A small garden patch near the entrance held late-season vegetables, their colors soft but alive. British guards moved without haste, their voices steady, almost courteous as they directed the new arrivals. Inside the wire, there was structure, but not harshness. Sleeping areas were tidy, blankets folded, windows cracked open for air. For soldiers who expected cruelty, this gentleness felt disorienting, as though the world was offering a version of captivity they had never been taught to imagine.
What lingered most in those first quiet hours was not fear, but an unexpected spaciousness, an emotional room they hadn't felt in years. In that space, small human gestures began to appear, almost shyly. A man brushing dust from his coat as if reclaiming a bit of dignity. Another adjusting his cap before entering the barracks, a habit from peacetime that had somehow survived. Someone hummed a few bars of a tune under his breath, barely audible, as though testing whether music was still allowed in such a place. No one paid it much mind, yet the sound drifted through the corridor like a thin thread of memory. There was nothing grand in these moments, nothing one would call art, but something quiet was stirring, something that did not belong to war at all. And it made the men wonder without quite saying it out loud. In a place built to confine them, what unexpected thing might begin to grow? They entered the camp with the slow, heavy steps of men who had not yet caught up with their own fate. After months of tension wound tight inside their bodies, a strange numbness settled over them, muting everything into a distant blur. They moved as if guided by memory rather than intention, their eyes drifting over fences, barracks, and faces without truly seeing any of it. The war had taken so much noise from them that now even their thoughts felt quiet, as if they were afraid to disturb the fragile calm they'd stumbled into. Some clutched small belongings, letters, a dented tin cup, a worn photograph, not out of hope, but because letting go of them would have meant admitting they were no longer soldiers, only prisoners trying to remember who they were beneath the uniforms. The British Guard.
What surprised them most in those first days was not the confinement, but the small freedoms woven quietly into camp life. In the barracks, they found bunks neatly arranged, each with a clean blanket folded at the foot, as if someone had taken time to prepare for their arrival. The air smelled faintly of wood and soap instead of sweat and decay, a gentleness that felt almost out of place in wartime. On a narrow table near the entrance lay a stack of worn books and newspapers, English mostly, but with a few German volumes donated by local townsfolk or previous captives. The men touched the pages with hesitant fingers, surprised that literature had found its way into a prisoner's world. Mornings began with orderly roll calls, followed by simple tasks that kept the camp running. Afternoons were left open, an unexpected gift of time that felt both liberating and unsettling. They walked freely within the wire, speaking quietly in small groups, adjusting to a rhythm that was slower and more humane than anything they had imagined. For soldiers raised on stories of British cruelty and moral weakness,
In the gentle looseness of those early afternoons, small traces of creativity began to appear, so subtle they almost went unnoticed. A man sitting on the barrack step took a scrap of wood left over from a repair job and began to shape it with a pocket knife, letting the curls fall quietly onto the dirt. Another soldier, leaning against the fence, sketched the outline of distant trees in a worn notebook, his pencil moving slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if remembering the feel of stillness on paper. Sometimes a soft humming drifted between the rows of buildings, a tune half remembered from home, carried on the air for only a moment before fading into the background murmur of the camp. These were not performances or deliberate acts of expression, they were simply just.
It happened on an afternoon so still that even the wind seemed to pause at the edge of the camp. The men were scattered in their quiet routines, some washing shirts in metal basins, others sitting in small circles, speaking in low voices. Then a single sound rose into the air, thin at first, as if unsure of its place. A harmonica. Its notes drifted softly from the doorway of one of the barracks, hesitant but clear, carrying a melody that belonged to gentler days. Heads lifted, not in alarm, but in an almost childlike curiosity. The tune wavered, then steadied, filling the empty spaces between the buildings, weaving itself into the stillness like a thread of warmth. The man playing was young, his shoulders narrow, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. It was as though he wasn't performing for anyone, just letting something long buried inside him find its way out. For months, every sound the soldiers heard had been born of fear. Explosions, orders, the sharp crack of rifles. But this was different. This was soft, human, familiar. It eased into their chests, loosening something tight. For a brief moment, the camp didn't feel like a prison at all. It felt like a place where life, against all odds, might begin again.
What startled the men even more than the music itself was the reaction it received. When the British officers walked past the barracks and heard the harmonica's gentle rise and fall, they didn't snap orders or silence it. Instead, they slowed their steps, as if the sound tugged at something familiar in them too. One officer paused near the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, listening with a quiet attentiveness that felt almost private. He exchanged a brief glance with the guard beside him, not of disapproval, but of soft recognition, as though the melody reminded them both that war had not stripped the world entirely of tenderness. Later that day, the officer returned with a small suggestion. If any prisoner possessed an instrument or could fashion one, he would allow them a time and place to play, so long as it caused no disturbance. The men weren't sure how to respond. Encouragement from the enemy felt disorienting, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground where roles blurred and assumptions faltered. Yet there was no mockery, no hidden cruelty.
only a simple willingness to let be.
Approached cautiously. If the enemy could feel moved by music, then what truly separated them at all? In the days that followed, the music began to gather people the way a warm fire pulls strangers closer on a cold night. At first, it was just a few men standing outside the barracks when the harmonica played, listening quietly, their shoulders softening as the melody settled around them. Then someone brought out a battered violin he had carried since the early months of the war, its case worn and edges frayed. He tuned it slowly, almost reverently, and when he joined the harmonica, the sound deepened into something that felt unexpectedly whole. Word spread gently through the camp, not through announcements, but through murmurs. There would be music in the yard after the evening meal. More men came, not to perform, but simply to be near whatever was taking shape. They brought stools, crates, even overturned buckets to sit on. Someone tapped a light rhythm on the lid of a tin pot, keeping time with the violin's unsteady bow. What had begun as scattered moments of sound slowly grew into familiar patterns, then into rough arrangements. Without deciding it outright, the group met again the next evening and the evening after that. The gatherings became the closest thing the camp had to a heartbeat, steady, hopeful, and quietly communal, hinting that something far larger was waiting just beyond the edges of these early songs. They built their first stage from whatever the camp no longer needed: discarded planks, crates that once held rations, and a few sturdy boards scavenged from an old storage shed.
Within days, locals had donated an old cello, a cracked drum, and a cornet whose brass had dulled with age. The prisoners repaired them with patient hands, using wire, wax, and bits of cloth until the instruments could sing again. Even sheet music was improvised, pages torn from notebooks and stitched together, lines drawn with charcoal, notes copied carefully from memory. On quiet afternoons, the men gathered to test their creations, adjusting strings, tightening drum skins, coaxing sound out of instruments that had long been silent. There was a kind of awe in the air, not loud or triumphant, but soft and steady, like watching life return to a frost-bitten branch. Behind the barbed wire and under watchful eyes, an orchestra was beginning to breathe, built not from abundance, but from determination, imagination, and the quiet insistence that beauty could be made anywhere. When the first full notes drifted across the camp, something inside the men softened in a way they hadn't expected. Music offered a space untouched by rank or defeat, a place where no one was a prisoner and no one was a guard, only listeners sharing the same fragile quiet. As the orchestra rehearsed in the open yard, the world beyond the wire seemed to fade, replaced by small pockets of stillness where men could remember who they had been before the war carved new shapes into them. A violin's gentle rise could summon a memory of childhood. The warm tremble of a cello could bring back the weight of a loved one's embrace. Even those who didn't understand the structure of music felt the calm it carried, like stepping briefly into a room where dignity had been waiting all along. For a little while, they were not defined by surrender or uniform. They were simply human beings, breathing in rhythm with the sound. Guards sometimes paused on their rounds, leaning subtly against the fence posts as the melodies washed over them, creating a quiet understanding that needed no translation. In those suspended moments, the camp felt less like a boundary and more like a shelter,
a small sanctuary built from shared stillness and the fragile courage of returning to oneself. The evening of the first concert arrived with a hush that spread naturally through the camp, as if even the air sensed something unusual was about to unfold. Men gathered slowly, taking their places on benches fashioned from long planks balanced across crates. Others stood near the back, arms crossed loosely, faces softened by curiosity rather than expectation. The makeshift stage glowed faintly in the fading light, lanterns hanging from hooks, casting warm circles across the musicians' focused expressions. When the conductor, once a schoolteacher, now simply a prisoner with steady hands, lifted his baton, a ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd.
The opening notes rose gently, carried by strings and breath, and the quiet hope of the men who played them. What startled everyone was the sight of British guards drifting toward the edges of the gathering, standing just inside the lantern glow. They did not interrupt or maintain distance. They waited, listening, their faces calm in the settling dusk. For a few moments, there was no war between them. The music held them all in the same delicate stillness, weaving a brief truce that felt more real than any treaty. When the final chord faded, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, warm, shared. And in that shared quiet, a quiet wonder took root. Even behind barbed wire, beauty had found a way to belong to everyone.
It began almost by accident, in the same unhurried way the music had begun. During an afternoon lull, someone found a tattered script tucked inside a donated book, a light-hearted play, missing a few pages but still readable. The men gathered around it, trading lines aloud with shy amusement, their voices rusty from disuse. Laughter, soft and uncertain, rippled through the group as they imagined who might play which role. Soon others brought forward scraps of text they had copied from memory or discovered in old camp magazines. Scenes from Goethe, fragments of farces, even a few comic sketches written by the prisoners themselves. The idea of performing them felt daring at first, almost childish, but it carried a spark that warmed the dull routine of captivity. Costumes emerged from the most unlikely places. Worn blankets were cut and re-sewn into cloaks. Flour sacks became waistcoats, with buttons carved from wood. Strips of colored paper were folded into makeshift decorations that fluttered lightly when actors moved.
Edjuk fashioned a wig from strands of twine, brushing and tying it until it looked strangely convincing. As they worked, the barracks filled with gentle chatter, rising energy, and a growing sense of possibility. Theater offered something different from music. An invitation to step into other lives, to speak words that belong to imagination rather than survival. And little by little, the camp began to feel less like a place defined by borders and more like a small, unexpected community of storytellers. The first performance was a simple comedy, staged on the same wooden platform the musicians used. Word had spread quietly through the camp, and by dusk, men gathered with the same gentle anticipation they once reserved for village festivals back home. Lanterns flickered against improvised back. As weeks passed, the repertoire grew bolder. A short drama explored longing and separation with lines that carried the weight of their own lives. An operetta followed, its melodies stitched together from memory, performed with such earnestness that even the guards lingered nearby to listen. Each performance offered a small escape, a chance to step outside the wires for an hour and into a world shaped by imagination rather than conflict.
In those moments, humor and storytelling became quiet acts of survival, reminding everyone that their spirits could still lift, even here. As the performances became a regular part of camp life, something subtle but unmistakable began to change in the spaces between the men. Tension, once a constant presence that clung to conversations and settled into their shoulders, began to ease. Soldiers who had barely spoken beyond necessity now discussed characters, quoted lines, or debated which jokes landed best. Creative work pulled them into small groups: costume makers, set painters, script keepers, each finding a role that let them contribute something of themselves. In these shared efforts,
talent and gentle quirks that war had nearly erased. Even the British Guard seemed to sense the shift. They walked through the camp with a slightly softer posture, sometimes pausing to watch a rehearsal from a respectful distance. The theater gave them a reason to gather in ways that felt natural and warm, filling the evenings with murmured laughter and quiet conversation. It bridged gaps between men of different ranks, regions, and temperaments, creating a small society built on stories instead of orders. In a place designed to strip life down to survival, the stage stitched threads of humanity back together. And in that restored warmth, the camp no longer felt like a world shrinking inward, but one gently expanding, held together by the fragile but powerful glue of shared imagination. In the slow rhythm of camp life, art became more than distraction. It became a kind of oxygen the men didn't realize they'd been deprived of. Each rehearsal, each sketch on a scrap of paper, each melody carried on evening air, gave shape to days that might otherwise have blurred into
one another. Routine in captivity could have felt hollow, but with the presence of music and theater, it gained layers of meaning that reminded the prisoners they were still individuals, not merely numbers in a ledger. A man who once built bridges found purpose in crafting props. Another, who had studied literature before the war, regained a piece of himself while directing scenes. Even those who didn't participate directly felt the steady influence of creativity, as if the arts offered gentle scaffolding that allowed their weary identities to stand upright again. In this confined world, art gave the men reasons to wake with a sense of direction, tasks to complete, stories to tell, moments to look forward to. It steadied them, anchoring their minds to memories of who they had been before the war's demands stripped them down. And in that anchoring, something essential resurfaced, the quiet recognition that resilience could take many forms, and sometimes the strongest kind was simply the ability to keep creating meaning in a place designed to take it away. As the weeks stretched into months, the creative life of the camp wove men together in ways that ordinary routine never could. Friendships formed naturally around shared tasks. Two actors practicing lines on a sunlit patch of ground. A violinist helping a newcomer adjust a borrowed bow. A painter offering tips to someone sketching for the respect blossomed between men who might never have spoken outside these walls. A former factory worker admired the quick wit of a university student. A stern sergeant softened toward the gentle humor of a tailor who stitched costumes with meticulous care. In these relationships, the hard lines of rank and history slowly blurred. The camp's wire still marked the boundaries of their world, but inside those boundaries, something warmer took root, a sense of belonging that surprised them all. And in that warmth, the story began to turn, preparing them for the quieter reflections that waited just ahead. When the men looked back on their time in the camp, It was often the small moments of beauty that rose to the surface first, softening the harsher edges of captivity. They remembered the way music drifted across the yard at dusk, or how a line spoken on stage made a barracks erupt in laughter. These memories didn't erase the loneliness or the longing, but they threaded warmth through them, turning what might have been years of bleak confinement into something more textured, more human. Even long after the war, many spoke of the camp not as a place of humiliation, but as a strange, suspended world where art had offered them shelter. Creativity had carved out pockets of gentleness inside a harsh reality, leaving behind a bittersweet sense that, in spite of everything, they had lived something meaningful there. And holding on to that softened memory made the closing of their story feel quieter, calmer, and easier to carry forward.
When the gates finally opened and the men were told they were free to go, the moment felt oddly weightless, as if reality needed time to catch up with the words. They had imagined release as a rush of joy, a surge of relief strong enough to sweep away every shadow of captivity. Instead, they stepped outside the wire with a gentler, more complicated emotion, something like sorrow woven with hope. The world beyond the camp felt unfamiliar, its vastness almost overwhelming after years inside orderly boundaries. Fields stretched out in quiet winter colors. Villages sat still beneath pale skies, and the road home felt long in ways none of them had expected. Germany itself bore the deep, tired marks of war. Towns were scarred. Familiar streets had changed. Families had endured losses too heavy to name in a single breath. The men returned as strangers to the places that had shaped them, carrying memories of music and theater that felt strangely out of place against the rubble and absence waiting at home. Yet there was resilience in their steps, a steady determination not born from victory, but from survival. The silence they found in their homeland was heavier than the silence of the front, but they faced it with a quiet strength shaped by everything they had learned behind the wire.
In the years that followed, the memories of their camp orchestras and makeshift theaters returned to them with a kind of gentle clarity, as if those moments had been preserved in a quieter corner of their minds. They recalled the soft glow of lanterns during evening rehearsals, the scratch of charcoal on paper as someone sketched a backdrop, the way a single violin note could still the entire yard. These images seemed untouched by time, held apart from the exhaustion and sorrow that had shaped so much of their service. For many, those creative hours became a place the mind returned to when the weight of rebuilding grew too heavy, a reminder that something tender had survived even in confinement. It wasn't nostalgia for the camp itself, but for the unexpected humanity they'd found there, the laughter, the shared breath of audiences, the fragile beauty that had carried them through. In remembering it, they felt a quiet stillness settle inside, as though those distant melodies continued to live on, gently guiding their hearts toward peace.
In time, many came to understand that what they had created behind the wire had been more than pastime or escape. It had been a quiet act of defiance, an insistence that even when freedom was taken, the inner world could still remain untouched. Beauty had become their way of refusing to let war decide who they were allowed to be. Every melody played on a borrowed violin, every line spoken from a makeshift stage, had pushed back gently against despair, reminding them that the human spirit could bend without breaking. Art had carried them through the long, uncertain days, offering a lifeline made not of rope or iron, but of imagination and shared breath. And as they stepped into the years ahead, they carried with them the simple, steady truth that had sustained them behind the barbed wire. Where beauty survives, hope survives with it. Quietly, but unwaveringly.